And for more reaction from the labour unions, we're joined now by Saftu's Zwelinzima, Vavi, and Cosatu's Matthew Parks. A very good evening to you both, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Let me start with you, Mr. Parks. The President didn't give much detail on the localization policy and its targets. What has been the discussions with the unions, and do you feel that it's going in the right direction in terms of the broader overview of its implementation?
Look, I think it's a first step in the right direction. We've got good plans. There's by and large consensus between government, business and labour about what needs to be done to drive up localization. If we want to rebuild the economy, we have to massively push a buy local campaign. That needs to stretch across the entire public sector, government, the municipalities, the SOEs and the entities, but also critically, it's a piece, so it has to include the private sector, from the retailers, the mining houses, other large corporations, but also it needs to critically include all of us as ordinary consumers. We must all actively buy locally produced clothing, shoes, health products, other equipment of life. That's all we're going to rebuild the economy. We're developing with the Department of Trade Industry and with business concrete, bold, buy local programs or target for each sector of the economy. It has to in that regard. So, for example, food industries, cooking oil, making sure all that they purchase is locally produced. We've seen the clothing industry, many of the clothing retailers have committed to rapidly increasing the buy local content. But again, we can have good plans, but will government come to the party and implement? And will the private sector come to the party? So us as consumers have to play a role. We have to actively, when we go to the shops, to the retailers, to the shopping centers, make sure we are looking at where these goods produced and are they locally produced, and only buy locally produced goods.
Mr. Vavi, that's the point for me, really, because if you are going to have a targeted localization program, it means that you have to create those jobs within the communities where the unemployed live. And if we're talking about the private sector and we're saying at a macroeconomic level, if unemployment, for instance, is dependent on the private sector, I mean, that's cyclical. And that also means that we're not looking for full-time work if we're going to rely too much on the private sector.
Absolutely. Spot on, Tepiso. And I think that we must go back to the basics again. The capitalist system, by its design, will never address even the most basic needs of our people for jobs, for eradication of poverty and the inequalities, or close the inequality gaps that exist in society. It's not default, it is by design. To again do exactly what has dismally failed for the 26 years, embark on a neoliberal program, embark on austerity that are going to lead to the cutting of even the frontline service delivery areas in the budget. Come the 21st of October, or now postponed for a week, we are going to see the point that we are making. And then to suddenly think that through infrastructure only, or with the piecemeal interventions here and here, you're going to change the direction of an economy that is reproducing poverty, unemployment, and inequalities. It is basically to live in a dream that is never going to come to any fruition. Saftu insist that the economy must be overhauled, and that the economy driven by a state that have a capacity to plan must drive the development, must crowd in private investment, and must make sure that our people are inspired on the basis of a true redistribution strategy that moves wealth and resources from the rich to the poor. If you don't have that overarching developmental interventionist strategy, and if you're going to just continue to rearrange words and announce programs that we have heard over and over again over the past 26 years, then it means that you are taking us for fools. For example, the whole thing of local procurement was signed long time ago whilst I was still in Cosatu. There is something called Local Procurement Accord. There is Education and Training Accord. There is a Green Economy Accord. There is a Collective Bargaining Accord. There is 5 Job Summit agreements. There is investment summits. All of those things have come to naught because they are all based on neoliberalism and austerity program that heavily rely on leadership.
So hold that thought, Mr. Vavi, because I'd like Mr. Parks to join in on this. As an alliance partner, Mr. Parks, what are your thoughts of this? And you also brought this up, the fact that he spoke about an infrastructure project that will emphasize locally made materials. As Mr. Vavi says, if we talk about the textile industry, for instance, you as Cosatu know this. For instance, we would focus more on investment from outside countries that would then come into the country and pretty much dominate, monopolize the industry, seeing that local workers are out of pocket and out of work.
Look, I think, Tsepiso, the public has a right to be skeptical. We ourselves are also skeptical, and that's a healthy approach to take, because as Zwelinzima said, there have been countless plans, been countless agreements which government and the private sector have time and again failed to honor. But right now we are in a crisis. We're in the worst crisis in 100 years. We've got a challenge of Eskom, a challenge of corruption, collapsing of state capacity, 52% unemployment. So we have a choice. We can complain, we can lament, we can throw our arms up in the air and be exasperated, or we can look at concrete, positive, practical solutions. So for us, the key things, we have to tackle corruption, wasteful expenditure, because otherwise, no matter what we do, we're throwing money down the drain. We have to make sure Eskom is rebuilt after a decade of state capture, so that, to ensure that there's reliable and affordable electricity to generate the economy. We need to ramp up infrastructure investments, especially in our ports, in our rail, in our energy, in our roads and water, which will boost manufacturing, boost agriculture, motor manufacturing, and so forth. Government has to really come to the party, because the public employment program they've offered, it honestly is too little. 800,000 jobs is a drop in the ocean out of 12 million people who are unemployed. But Tsepiso, government can do so much. It only has so much resources, in all honesty. The private sector has been sitting on the sidelines for far too long. The banks, the investment funds are sitting on hundreds of billions of rands, which they now need to bring to the table like never before, because no one is going to emerge unscathed from this economic crisis if we all don't contribute.
So, Mr. Parks, let me ask you this question, because you mentioned the issue of capacity earlier on. So if unemployment is largely a monetary policy problem, are we managing it well? A monetary and fiscal policy, do we have the capacity? You mentioned it earlier on. And is it in tandem with our broader goals on mass employment schemes that we're presenting?
Look, I think a couple of things, Tsepiso. One is that we have to move away from austerity program. You can't expect a patient to get better by denying them the medication they need whilst they're in the ICU. So the approach of Treasury is simply say we'll somehow miraculously get out of an economic crisis by closing the taps is delusional, is dangerous at best. So we have to inject liquidity into the economy, and there is money available. If you can deal with corruption and wasteful expenditure, which consumes about 150 billion rand a year, that's huge amounts of resources. If you can capacitate SARS to deal with the billions we lose in tax evasion, to capacitate SARS to deal with the hundreds of billions of rands we lose in customs enforcement, if you reprioritize the existing budget allocation to departments towards economic investments, there is money. But again, the banks have to come to the party. The investment funds have to come to the party and play their role. But I think also lastly, Tsepiso, it's about a political will from government. All too often we have ministers and DGs, premiers and mayors who are just simply out of their depth. They do not know how to grow an economy. They need to make way for those who can do their job. Equally, the private sector has to show a basic level of patriotism towards rebuilding the economy. You cannot have banks, big four banks, each retrenching 2,000 workers in the last few years, whilst paying the CEOs 150,000 rand a day, and think we're going to change the situation. So it's about showing solidarity across the board, That is how we're going to rebuild this economy.
And I want to talk about that, Mr. Vavi, seeing that there is a view that mass employment generally, the programs should include a shared vision that is effective leadership, but also reform regarding the relaxation of labor regulations. Is there evidence of this?
That's where I think Network is going to. And I think the employers have succeeded in the previous round of negotiations when Cosatu Congress in 2012 demanded a national minimum wage. What they got then in return, the bosses, was not just a ridiculously low national minimum wage, but was also to launch a counter-attack and take away the right of workers to strike, to picket, and to demonstrate, and which have been fundamentally weakened by the amendments that have been done. But let me tell you what is that we're dealing with here. We're dealing here with the president who knows what is the problem. The problem of NEDLAC is that the Cosatu, Petusa, and non-existent NACTU all combined, they have a membership now that is 80% public service. This membership or this federation are not sensitive enough to the realities, the real ravages and the brutalities of the system in the private sector, in the manufacturing sector. NUMSA, FAO, AMCU, and all of the biggest proletariat organizations are locked out of NEDLAC. So you have some people trying to shave the heads of workers in their absence. The product is what you're going to see, which is what we see now, a reformed structural adjustment program. Secondly, even for the public sector, what we are seeing through this speech is an introduction systematically of a two-tier market, a labor market system in the public sector. Government is under pressure from the IMF, World Bank, and the rating agencies to keep the wages of the public sector, the wage bill, under check. But it is also under pressure from the realities exposed by the COVID, that our hospitals have chronic staff shortages, our police stations are in dire need of more police officials, our correctional services centers are overflowing with little numbers of correctional services, and generally our administration is facing distress because the numbers are declining. Government have been embarking on what they call natural attrition after they have failed to cut 40,000 jobs under Pravin Gordhan. These two pressures make government now to say, okay, we're going to introduce now something we call assistant teachers. We're going to use the extended public works program to do jobs of permanent municipal workers. We're going now to introduce a second layer of what we call the childhood developers, the community healthcare workers. All of them are not going to be insourced on a permanent basis so that they can enjoy the same benefits as the rest of the public sector workers. They will come in as precarious forms of employment. And I mean, Cosatu agrees to this. Fedusa, you agree to this, comrades. What's wrong with you? Can you see that this is the most brutal attack on the living standards of the workers in this country, more than the apartheid government have ever done, to pick, to put hundreds of thousands of people into that scheme?
Let's give Mr. Parks an opportunity to respond.
Actual betrayal, I'd like to
give Mr. Parks an opportunity to respond. And if you could also talk about the fact that government has also made it clear that reducing government expenditure is part of the plan, and that certainly hits civil servants in the pocket as well. So how does that address the issue of the unemployed, especially those who are already in very difficult situations? But if you could just respond to some of the comments that Mr. Vavi have been saying about your collective bargaining.
Sure. Look, it's unfortunate that the Comrade Zweli time and again chooses to deflect from Saftu's inherent weaknesses and to shift blame to other trade union federations. Most of the things he said is actually not factually true. The minimum wage that was achieved was in line with the Cosatu Collective Bargaining Conference when he was still the General Secretary of Cosatu. It, in fact, at 20 Rand, when it was signed, was higher than the wage agreements that FAO and NUMSA sign at 13 Rand, 11 Rand, 12 Rand, 14 Rand for their members. So it's slightly hypocritical to attack something when his own unions are signing for amounts far below. There was no fundamental changes to the right to strike or picket in the amended Labour Relations Act. That is something the employers had tried, which Cosatu had blocked at NEDLAC. Again, let's stick to the facts. I'm not sure when last did Comrades really look at the Cosatu membership, but the majority of our members, over 50%, work in the private sector. That's in the mining sector, the banking sector, the clothing and textile industries, farm workers, security guards, cleaners, etc. And in fact, we're having more and more private sector unions applying to join us. And in fact, in August, the third largest affiliate of Saftu, the National Transport Movement, rejoined Cosatu. Another group left FAWU in February, rejoined Cosatu. I'm not sure what is left of Saftu, but I don't want to get into a fight. If Comrades really is so passionate about joining NEDLAC, perhaps they must actually submit a complete application to NEDLAC. When they submitted an incomplete application years after complaining they had been excluded, but the application did not include verified membership figures or audited financial statements, which are the requirements of all trade union federations to remain in standing with the Department of Labour. Those requirements were there when Comrades Zwelinzima was the GS of Cosatu and denied admission to Cosau. We're not sure why, when he's outside, he now cries about issues. But I think, Tsepiso, to your other question, we wouldn't agree with Treasury, which is to say an austerity approach is how you're going to grow the economy. It defies logic. If you look at the US, what Europe, what Russia and China are doing, they're injecting money into the economy to grow it. And equally, there's no point in government glorifying essential workers, nurses and doctors, police and prisons officers, other public servants, for keeping the nation afloat during the lockdown when politicians were hiding at home, yet now want to rob them of a small little inflationary increase. Okay. That is treating workers as slaves. It's actually hurt the economy. To address the
I do apologize, but unfortunately we have run out of time. And Mr. Vavi, I wish I had time to give you an opportunity to respond. Hopefully a conversation for another day. Thank you very much to both of you. Zwelinzima Vavi, Saftu's General Secretary, and Cosatu's Parliamentary Coordinator, Matthew Parks. Thank you very much. Of course, we'll continue getting various reactions from various quarters, but we will be speaking to Dr. T.K. Boyer, who is a senior lecturer at Wits School of Governance, to get political analysis on this, especially the president's emphasis on a new social compact that has emerged out of this. Does he really agree? What are the main features of this according to his point of view and others? That's all coming up. A quick break. We'll be back shortly.